the Reverend Dr. Rhyd Wildermuth.
Hey, Gordon.
Hey, welcome back. How you doing?
I am great. I'm a little on the tired side, but otherwise okay. But you must be more tired since you just woke up.
Yeah. So 7 a.m. here. I got up at 5 so that I could have like sufficient caffeine before we hit record. So I got a buzz going. I'm good. I'm good to jump in.
Good.
Anyway, for people listening on the audio, we are going to be talking about Rhyd's latest book, Being Pagan. Wait, I have it here. Let me embiggen, and I can show. And even with the tabs from when I in a very organized fashion was arranging my questions. All right.
Sure. Actually, I just got your book like 2 days ago. But these are not tabs. These are the cool bookmarks that the Scarlets sent.
I know, they're amazing.
They're fucking amazing. Yeah. So I'd love to talk about your book, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet.
No, that's all right. It's when we were arranging this, whatever it was, a month or so ago, I'm like, I'm reading your book. There's a lot of overlap. So like in many ways, I'm kind of like pre-prepared for it. But we should actually start with like, why this book? Why Being Pagan?
It's so weird. I never thought about it that way. I never even thought that was a question. Why? I guess maybe the better question is why being pagan as opposed to, belonging to paganism or identifying as pagan or whatever. Like the core word in there is being, not the pagan part. I've identified, as it were, as a pagan for at least 20 years now. But also, can I stop you? Are you hearing too much street noise here?
No, but what I am hearing is static. Like every time you're talking on your mic, I'm hearing static. I don't know if anyone in the chat wants to jump in. I don't know, it feels like the mic isn't properly plugged in or something. Like it feels like one of those kind of situations. Give it a shot.
Mind if I adjust real quickly here?
Yeah, go for it.
All right, let me try with the native mic.
Oh, so someone in the chat saying they do hear static as well. So it might be, it's typically when the mic isn't plugged in properly.
Is this better? Because I just
much better.
Oh,
much better.
Great. Great. Okay.
All right, awesome. So carry on. Yeah. Because I'll tell you why. And if you're watching this live, the video on YouTube is called Talking Paganism with Rhyd Wildermuth. And like seconds before we started, I'm like, I'm going to change the overlay so that it's actually Talking Pagan Beingness, which is one of those fake $5 academic words, right? But it's closer to the book anyway, like Talking Pagan Beingness. So like why this book is how I'm going to tee that up. Like not only why this book, but like why that title.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. So that was the core thing I was trying to attempt. I've done all of the go to pagan events and talk to the pagans, as it were, or what it's probably better described as neo-pagan, I guess. And there was always a sense where like, okay, you believe these things. This is how you see the world supposedly, but your life is absolutely just exactly like the general everyday urban, consumer. What precisely is different about, pagan for most people, and if you look at it, it's the same thing that happens with witchcraft or any other of the, aligned ideas. And over the last, I guess, 6 or 7 years, my life is it was turned upside down. I'm now living in Europe. I was not living in Europe 7 years ago. This all kind of started when I started having crazy, as it were, dreams. And at the beginning of the streams, it started changing my way of relating to myself and everything around me, to a point where it stripped a lot of my feeling that I needed to believe the right things or do the right things. Instead, it became, wait, what is this question of being? What is it? What does being mean? We or we say we're human beings, and then there are like, things that are more than human beings or other than human beings, etc. But when we think about that, we forget about the idea of being itself. That it's the equivalent of a active, constantly in process verb. You don't be a pagan. You are being pagan. You are in a state of constant beingness, as it were. And it's, I try to describe that a bit in the introduction, and then further on in the chapters where I talk about magic and the body. But that was writing that was my attempt to explain how embodying this. I don't really like the word embody, because we are in bodies like already. We're you don't have to embody anything. It's more a question of noticing that you're already embodying something. But this was my attempt to describe for people what that meant, what it means to be and be part of being, instead of going to all the cool conferences, buying all of the cool books. No offense, like, no, your books are cool, my books are cool, buy our books. But that doesn't, that has nothing to do with anything that was described as pagan by the Romans before the Christians even got around. This idea that these people were being in a way that is completely different from our urban existence. We're going to smear them, etc. We could talk about that later. But.
Yeah. No, I like that. Yeah, I like that. It's the reason, because we need to, like, I think I'm going to tee up a bit of the why this book stuff, right? Because my impression reading it is that whilst you have written it for other people, it is also written for you as a way of clarifying.
Yeah. Isn't that everything though? All writing is
exactly. But, like, this is quite explicit, and it ties back to the title, because, as you say, like, embodied is not a great word, but it's what we have, and in general, being is that. Hence why I'm making it beingness as this kind of like overly to highlight it. Like, when people see beingness, they're like, well, that isn't right, and I'm like, yeah, but neither is how we typically frame and encounter being. So like, you actually that's kind of like the point. And there's sort of two ways you can come at it. In the 70s, and this influence like chaos magic, is this whole idea of V prime, where you recreate the English language without the word to be. And the reason for that is that there is no, but I think they've located the error in the wrong place. They've located the error, which is there kind of like linguistically rather than in the cosmovision. Because there's no evidence for beingness as we typically use it in a static state, right? Like, so you're not, I am hungry, I'm like, I have hunger, or I'm with hunger, are like better ways of saying it, because that's kind of like, but funnily enough, that is, I think, a healthy version of being or beingness. So that's kind of why I wanted to begin like with the actual title itself, because, as you say, it's not a book about going to conferences and, dare I say, I mean, yeah, buy our fucking books, but dare I say, having the correct opinions on Twitter. It's not no correct opinions on Twitter,
just to be clear.
Yeah, nice one. So that, like, so is the, and I'll we have to go back to why this book, but I want to do it this way. For super fans of the show, they may have noticed there hasn't been a single episode in the, whatever I'm up to now, 270, 280, about paganism, because I don't care. At all. And I get sent books by every publisher and whatever. And God bless, again, like, God bless the people who write them and do care about that stuff. I truly do not. And I truly do not, because of the, I think, implied critiques that are in this book. And that's why this is, at least so far, the only book on a subject that can hit that definition, because it's, I thought it was irredeemable. I thought that the term is irredeemable, and I mean, up until something like this, maybe it has been, but like, you get what I mean, right? Where I'm not, there's nothing in that for me, and that has actually been there since forever. Like, it must have been, if it wasn't Dr. Christopher Hyatt, it was one of those other like New Falcon 1980s people who were sort of critiquing Wicca at the time. And it's back to what you said, these very unhealthy people living urban lives and getting together, 4 times a year to like go camping in not even a national park, but a campground, and then be
they're not camping. They're usually glamping. They're usually
which I like glamping. I'm not going to lie, but I'm also not pretending that I'm like participating in a nature religion.
There's nothing about it. No.
Yeah.
Well, and that's interesting actually. I think what helped a lot with this book and also understanding this was being immersed in countries with different languages besides English. One of the things that I was just thinking about the glamping, camping thing. There are 2 types of camping in the French language. There's camping, you fais le camping, which is you go to a campgrounds, and those campgrounds are actually kind of nice. There's a municipal campground in almost every little town and village, especially in tourist destinations. There are 5 or 6 of them. Sometimes those have a pool. Other times it's just a lot of grass with an electricity hookup if you've got a RV, or a shower block. Sometimes those are very primitive and it's kind of fun. But so that's camping. You faire le camping comme ça. But then there's also camping sauvage, wild camping, and that's actually illegal in most places in France. It is illegal to just go take your tent and go into the woods somewhere and put it down and just be there. If you're going to be engaging with things, like you can't do it in a sauvage way, which is of course savage and wild. You have to do it in a civilized way. If you're going to interact with nature, it must be a civilized way of doing that. And actually reflecting on that, my first pilgrimage to Europe, which was just me roaming around for 3 months with a backpack and dreams and just listening to whatever weird thing came in my head, was mostly camping. And I kept thinking about that reflection, okay, no, this is camping, but you can't do camping sauvage. You can't do the savage, the wild. And for me, that was like, oh, well, I think that's also kind of the problem with paganism in the United States, particularly, or the Anglo-American idea of the camping, where it's like, we love the wild, we love the forest, we love all of this, but we love it in a specifically civilized, non-sauvage, non-savage way. And I try to get that across in the book as well. But when you say you don't care about paganism, and I can feel the sort of like nausea, like the kind of trying to hold down a little bit of vomit that you're kind of expressing, because I feel the same way too. That was the hardest thing for me. I could have abandoned the label at any point, just like I could at any point abandon Marxist or leftist, because a lot of times those sorts of people kind of make me want to throw up as well. But
there's a Venn situation going on there, which is we're going to have that chat later.
But what I mean is that there was always a reason why I kept thinking there was something else here that I needed to scratch at and keep getting at. And part of that was, interacting with other cultures, being in, learning other languages, being in contexts where other languages were speaking, and realizing, oh, like even the way we talk about the wild, or even the way we talk about gods or paganism or any of that, is highly limited by our language. So anyway.
Yeah, no, that's good. Which means, speaking of limits of language and so on, because I want to pick up there are, in the same way I don't care about paganism, most people, and rightly so, and for the same reasons, don't care about chaos magic, and the other one being permaculture. And I keep both those labels. And I keep both those labels, even though they annoy me. And I think it's for the same reason, which is like, no, there's still some energy in this, and it's an irritating energy. And I want to know where that goes, because it's not even a necessary, like I refuse to cede the ground to people who I think, quite frankly, have lost the plot. But more, it isn't as intransigent as that. It's actually on a personal level, there's still some energy in those terms for me. And I kind of get that sense with something like being pagan, because as you say, you can be any of these groups, you can, especially at the moment, be dismayed at in a visceral way. But that maybe isn't enough to leave it alone, which is why I went to, speaking of language, do something very annoying and ask for your definition of paganism.
Actually, I don't really want to define paganism, but I do want to define pagan, you know, and I go through this as well in the book. It's the first main chapter, not the introduction, but you know, it's a smear. A smear like heathen is a smear, or a smear like rustic, or a smear like redneck or hillbilly, or any of that is. You know, this was it was the way that the Romans, starting out, attempted to describe the behaviors of people living in a certain geographical location compared to the city. They were living past the paganos, you know, very similar to the idea of the beyond the pale during the occupation of Ireland, where, you know, everybody who lived behind these or beyond these pales, which were just little markers, you know, they were a different kind of people. They were savage, they were wild, they were not part of us. Pagan was what the Romans used to describe those sorts of people. They're very close to, you know, Agamben's idea of raw life, or the people who are still more in Zoe than Bios, but that's a different topic altogether. You know, heathen was the same way. Heathen specifically described people living on heaths, you know, just like pagans were people specifically living in the area that would make them paganos. You know, it is a geographic location that people saw as uncivilized, as too rural, as full of superstition, full of ridiculous, older, ancient ways of relating to the world and to each other. You know, and you're an animist, and you just wrote a book on animism. You would understand that that's the same thing. It's the you know, those older ideas of relating to the world, thinking, hey, there's something in that forest besides just the forest. You know, that's superstition. That's in the past, as it were. But that's what I mean by pagan, is the kind of the same thing in a way. The way of relating to the world that is outside of the concerns of the civitas or the polis.
Yeah, and that is the key, that's like crucial, right? So one of the things that I do despair of in paganism, but not just paganism, any of these kind of like previously rejected and ridiculed cosmovisions, and the worst sort of the worst culprit, or like the worst perpetrator at the moment is astrology, is these things I think are definitionally satanic in the sense that they actually are formed of the rejection of like urban, like by definition, like the kind of like faces, two vase, two face kind of thing, vase, two faces. It belongs as the outside of an urban cosmovision, and I have tremendous what I find frustrating is an attempt to elevate and make safe and make acceptable to the power structure something that I don't think, like, those two faces can't ever be the vase. And that's, I think, one of the tensions I have with it. And if you try to push it into acceptability, it becomes a pseudo thing. It becomes, it museumifies it back into it, and they're like just sort of definitionally, and it's extremely important at the moment when we sort of come to understand, I don't want to say politics, but we come to understand power and difference in this moment, is you actually, it's not entirely described by saying an urban-rural divide, but it's described pretty well. It gets you between 60 and 70% of the way there. And I would
bring up the Enlightenment idea of the noble savage, and the obsession that the early age of reason thinkers had. You know, they were all European, but it wasn't just their Europeanness that made them this way. Their obsession with the primitive. You know, these people, which, you know, it's very often forgotten. And whenever I teach Marxism, I try to remind people, hey, primitive does not actually mean backward, stupid, or lower level. All it means is first. you know, it's primary, but then later on, primitive got this extra sense that well, primitives are also stupid. It's a bit actually the same way the pagan, pagan originally described a people living outside of the city. Primitive originally described people living in more primary ways of relating to each other in more basic, as it were, villages instead of big cities. But there was this obsession, this fascination with the primitives of, say Africa or South America or what have you, that eventually it came to define what opposition to normal civil society in Europe meant. So that, if you didn't want to go along with the way things are, if you wanted to rebel, then you're going to act a little bit more like the primitives. You were going to be obsessed with being like them. You still see this in Germany, actually. You see Germans dressing up like Native Americans, with headdresses. They're like, the worst of all of this. The French are also this bad too. They have Western themed amusement parks. But it's because, they're trying to rebel against society, but they're using this image of what they think is the opposite of the society against which they're fighting for. It's just like the teenager who is like, yeah, fuck you parents. Like, I don't want to go to church anymore. I'm a Satanist, because it's the only thing that comes into mind as the alternative to this like society, this society that you want to rebel against. And I think you see that with, what you're talking about with astrology now. It's like, people are describing, it's a religion, it's an alternative religion, it's a religion that's opposed to all of these other things, or even the way that people embrace witchcraft as as if they are being primitive. But then, there's kind of the joke, like, well, you're not living on the outside of the village because the villagers are afraid of you and they reluctantly go to you anyway because they know how to do stuff. You're living in an apartment in the middle of the city and doing your witchcraft on your phone. Like, that isn't opposition. That isn't the actual position of rebellion. You're just using this fantasy you have of what the opposition is to the society.
Yeah. And that's a bit right. That's like real Mark Fisher stuff, right? Because I would actually take it further with astrology in particular, although witchcraft on TikTok is the same kind of idea, where it's allowed them to create an entire religion based on this sort of the acceptable power worldview of identitarianism. Like, if you actually look at how astrology is done at the moment, it's like some sort of demented HR game, and it's done by people who actually work in these social media companies and the rest of it. And this is the opposite of, and it's that kind of this is why I think everyone has to be a little bit Gnostic, to be in a completely captured, like you're upended under a glass sense of like going me, like expressing this sort of rebellion inside something that is the complete opposite. It's been made muted.
It's Emmanuel Goldstein, like 1984. It's Emmanuel Goldstein. It's the like, we are going to completely, rebel against Big Brother and all of the society. And here is our way of rebelling. And it turns out Emmanuel Goldstein is actually a creation of the society against which we're rebelling. It's the same thing.
And this is why, like, I like the being paganism, and where we've got to with the at least definition or framework for pagan and pagan beingness is. If you stay with the energy that's still in that word, it can kind of like, it can, if you're paying attention to it, sort of like literally putting your awareness on it, it can begin that process of pulling you out. And I think the book's kind of like an elaboration of that sort of stuff. Because it's sort of, I think the majority of people who are in that weaponized identitarianism parading as witchcraft and astrology world, it's a good way of saying it, their hearts are probably in the right place. And there's a kind of case of, oh wait, I thought it was this, and maybe not. Maybe I'm being nicer to them than they could be. But at the moment, that's kind of why I've been wholly disinterested in like official paganism as it is expressed at the moment, because especially the last couple of years, for it to be pagan to me, it needs to be the stuff rejected by the polis and by like an urban framework, and it's been the opposite. It's been like, just it's been an Instagram filter on official reality.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's it. I thought about including it within the book, but I didn't. It was kind of a very bitter essay that I wrote a few years ago. I called it Paganism TM. And we have mutual friends, you and I, and I was staying with them, and this is when they were in Shropshire. And I remember we went to an old ancient standing stone circle, and there was a lot of trash there, but it wasn't trash. It was all fun little sacrificial tokens. And the thing that was most peculiar to me, the thing that stuck in my head, was there were these plastic, cheap, pink fairies, and someone had bought these and had left them on an ancient standing stone or at the foot of one as like an offering to that place or whatever, as part of a prayer. And I remember, so they had a habit, and they still do apparently, of cleaning up these sites. Just hey, people left trash here, I'm gonna throw it away. And I remember like Peter like picking up the stuff and throwing it really hard, like away. And like, and he called it like pagan trash or neo-pagan trash or something. And I was like, but their hearts are in the right place, right? They're still trying to like, they recognize there's something here, and they're trying to do this like kind of almost innocent, like, or naive, depending on how you want to look at it, like human thing of like, I want to give something here. But it was like at the exact same moment that I told him that, I'm like, no, but you're being so harsh. Why are you doing this? This image is fucking like hit me in the head, like right in the brain, and I could not get it out of my head. Where I'm suddenly seeing all of these extremely low-paid Chinese factory workers stamping pink plastic, which is of course just petroleum, into the shape of fairies to sell to Europeans so that they can, like it was this moment where I'm like, oh, right. Yeah, this is trash. And it's not just trash, but it's like, it's psychic trash. It's like, wow, this stuff is like, this stuff holds the exploitation of these people within it. And you're trying to like, what do you even think you're doing with this? And it's like, no, this is not an innocent gesture.
No, it's not.
It seems very harsh. And yeah, it's like, to some extent we do have to be like, oh, okay, I see, I see what you're trying to do here. And it's really nice that you're trying to do this, but don't do that. You're harming things. Like, this is not the right way. And actually you are making things worse for yourself and for anyone else who's trying to get to the same truth that you are clumsily, getting into, or running away from, but you think you're running into it,
The cosmovision of the that's inside the urban cosmovision, right? Like the entirety of that is inside the urban cosmovision, and a pagan one is defined in opposition to it. So I agree. It's funny, like we'll get to it eventually, maybe it's now. Something I think you and I politically would agree that there's no such thing as moderate. Like people may want to be center left as a kind of benign position, but I don't view it as benign, because it's being vociferously for war and destruction of the environment. And so
left is the dominant imperialist position.
Yeah, exactly.
So like, okay, cool. I'm pro-Rome. Like, okay, great.
Yeah. So something Catherine Fitz has been saying the last couple of years is the middle of the road is going away. And she's sort of talking to people who would be like, oh, I might vote Democrat because I'm a little bit nice or whatever. And the middle of the road, I would say, has never been there if you look at it from this sort of framework. And that's kind of where I think that situation of, unless a drag queen did it, like these plastic Chinese fairies, Chinese made fairies, like that's absolutely It's like cutting the sandwich on the diagonal rather than the horizontal. Like we're still dealing with reality here, but there is a stringency that's required that I think you're gentle in the book, but there is a stringency I think that's required in carving it out, because it is that like it is outside Rome. That's just kind of what it is. So are you Rome or are you not? And inside Rome is that kind of little bit to the left, little bit to the right, but I'm broadly okay with how we're going.
Goes into Rome. That middle road goes into Rome,
Yeah.
and it goes out of Rome because it was Rome that built the idea of roads. You know, like Rome has laid all of these roads throughout all of the land. Like that, the attempt to kind of like, oh, well, you know, I'm not going to take these positions, or, you know, society is generally good, you know, things could be a little bit better. It's like, oh, okay, so you're in the city and you're the one who's defending it from the barbarians or whatever, but those are really just poor people. You know?
Yeah, well, that's certainly been the case the last couple of years with the worldwide destruction of the working class, cheered on by people who pretend that they're on that side, which I'm sure we'll get to. But I want to get there via something that this is where one of the big overlaps is between like my book and your book. So talk to us about machine time and like and where we get that from, because I'm actually giving a talk in a couple of weeks on sort of like non-Western experiences of time, assuming we're all allowed to travel in Mexico in a few weeks. So this was kind of like front of mind for me. But like, what's machine time? Where do we get it from?
Yeah, so my understanding of machine time first came from E.P. Thompson, who wrote, was it Time Discipline? I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of it. It's a great, absolutely great essay, long.
Time, work discipline, and industrial capitalism.
Exactly. Yes. And thank you. Yeah, it is. Right. So he pointed out that in order to create the working class, the modern idea of the working class, and this is, you know, if you don't have a background in Marxism, not everybody would understand this, but before capitalism, before industrial capitalism, you know, we were something else. You know, sure, we were workers, but not necessarily always waged, and we had a different way of relating to work, to time, to the land around us. That doesn't necessarily mean we were innocent, you know, primitive, savage, whatever, like this noble savage idea. But we related to the world differently. And those ways of relating, which you can see this repeat. Actually, let me go on this and then I'll go back to this tangent. But our ways of relating to time before did not work very well for factories. When people woke up, they woke up early in order to go do things on the farm or, you know, with their animals. You have animals, right? It's chickens. Mm-hmm. You have to let the chickens out of the coop early in the morning. You have to put them in before night falls so that they don't get hurt. You know, our relationship to time was related or was set by daily activities that were natural activities, as it were. You know, when you could do work, when you couldn't do work. You know, sun falls, you can't do any work outside any longer because it's too dark. The sun rises, so that's when you go do the work because you're not using electric lights, etc. This sort of a way of relating to time, which is, you know, what I call natural time, was most of the history of humanity. You know, we didn't have little machines to tell us when time worked. That doesn't mean that we didn't have clocks. We've had clocks or some sort of timekeeping pieces, mostly made by magicians and priests for thousands of years. But these were never part of daily life until the birth of industrial capitalism. Because in order to arrange industrial production, you need everybody to be coming in at the same time. You need everybody to be leaving at the same time. You need to measure their work according to a standard time. And so that led to the implementation of time discipline, as E.P. Thompson calls it, where we literally had to learn how to be on time. The tangent I was about to get to, which I think is the best way of describing this, is I saw this recently. It was in the BBC about 2 years ago, where someone was complaining about African time. and that Africans are still, and it was an African businessman, actually. I think he was from Kenya, I'm not sure, but he was complaining about how all of the Africans around him, all of the, Kenyans around him were still operating on African time. And by African time, what he meant was not clock time. When he said, you need to be at work at 9, they would show up when they wanted to, or when they were ready to go. And it's like, no, you cannot do this. You cannot do this because we need to use this Western idea of time, which is really time discipline. And one of the things that colonialists or imperialist powers have complained about, since the birth of industrialization is how these conquered people just will not show up when you tell them to. They will not, they don't know how to work. They don't know how to be on time. So they have to be disciplined into that. But that same thing was already disciplined into people who lived in Europe in between the 1600s till today. Like, we're still constantly learning how to do this. When you go to school, in most standardized schools, you have to arrive at a certain time, then the bell rings. As soon as the bell rings, you get up and you go to your next class. And that was to get you prepared for the factory. That's factory time or machine time. So that's what I mean by that. Machine time being a new way, a new cosmological framework or a new societal framework that did not exist before, and is relatively recent in the history of humanity, only about 300 or 400 years ago, or 300 or 400 years old. And the time before that, natural time, as it were, sunset, sunrise, you do certain things in the summer, certain things in the winter, that would be closer to the idea of pagan time, or what I mean by pagan.
Yeah. It's like it brought up something which I'm working on for the presentation. In the early 90s, during Michael Palin, he did a series of documentaries for the BBC on like around the world in 40 days and all this kind of stuff. And this allegedly post-Soviet world, although I think I sent you that Fukuyama meme.
I saw that, yes.
Yeah,
I
wrote
about it. I wrote about the end of history too. But anyway,
yeah. And so I think it was somewhere in Africa. This is in the early 90s, North Africa somewhere, and he was getting a train, I think, down south. I think this was the north-south. And they couldn't tell him when the train was going to leave because the train left when it was full of people. And why that stuck with me for like decades is because we have this machine time, and specifically time zones, because of the imperial expansion of trains. And even just inside Britain, being able to calculate the sort of 2-minute time difference, like on a machine clock sense between, say, London and Bristol. Technically, it's sort of like, although it's inside the same time zone, because it's further across in that time zone, it's like a 2-minute difference. And so this idea that you would be, and the thing is, a train only becomes a train when it's like a passenger train only exists in reality, as I understand it, when it's carrying passengers. Like if a train leaves with nothing in it, it's not a passenger train. And so you actually get this logic of, well, the train leaves when it's a fucking train. And there's this idea, and there's this, in animism, well, in animistic, again, the same sort of thing is encountered when anthropologists are trying to, and this was an Aboriginal encounter, I forget who, but sort of being shown the fishing customs of a particular people. And they're like, so, what time tomorrow? Like, what time are we doing it? Like 9 a.m. tomorrow? And they're like, well, we fish when it's fishing time. And so the anthropologist would show up the next day on the beach and there's no one there because there were no fish. And It's this sort of this reality of like, well, why would you go fishing if there are no fish? Right. And this is the kind of difference between the machine time and real time. And when it comes to hours, the one well, go
Can I mention something too? Because there's right there is also kind of the core of the animist belief of like the fish tell you when it's time to fish.
Correct.
Just like the plant tells you when it's time to harvest. You don't tell the plant when it's time to fruit. It says, hey, I'm full of fruit. It's time to harvest. And it's like, well, why didn't you harvest it last week? Well, it wasn't full of fruit. The tree was the tree told me it's not ready. Like there's no lie there. Like the tree is literally saying like there's nothing here. See.
Machine time exists only in relation to its own self and precision, right? Like, and that's why it like literally doesn't exist. It's this artifact of like in capture, and the one that I think people for a lot of people who are magically operant, the way into this is the difference between an hour and a planetary hour. So planetary hours are calculated based on the amount of, a division between sunrise and sunset into a number of hours, which is 12, right? So in summer, they're longer. In winter, they're shorter. And we have them as this 60-minute thing where it isn't related to anything except itself as a machine, whereas planetary hours are calculated in relation to the entire cosmos. And so we actually have this. And this is why the machine time difference is so important to talk about, because whilst we have to operate in it inside, Rome, just to stay a little bit Gnostic with the metaphor, there are ways out of it, and the ways out of it are philosophical, metaphysical. So like a train without passengers in it isn't a passenger train until it is, and that's kind of, I think, really important. So I'm sort of happy that's in there in the book. And I quite like, and here's a really good example, and maybe it's in the essay you mentioned, but in the book I like how you describe bell towers in villages becoming clock towers, because a bell tower rings at vespers, right? Like it rings at sunrise, or it rings when there is a moment in time that is real to the village, whereas a clock tower is just machine time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's where we put the clocks. We put them right on the sacred houses in the middle of every little village.
Yeah, absolutely. So staying with time, because this is, if you get through this, it sort of opens up other things, which you kind of discuss in the book that I think is really exciting as well, is this idea of like, what's a good way of understanding ancestry and tradition? Tradition being a function of like continuity of time, but like what kind of time and so on. But like there's a whole big bunch in the book about things like ancestry and tradition being important in how we understand pagan beingness at this moment in history, because there are some low resolution takes that don't, and there's some stuff in it that's good, but there are some low resolution takes of dismissing it as being sort of ethnically
fascist,
derived. Yeah.
If you look at who, okay, I am living in a village for the first time since I was 12. I grew up in a very rural, extremely poor place in the United States, in Appalachia. For the first time in my life, I am now again living in a village. Now, it's not poor, but it is a village. And the people living here have a very long connection to this place. The house that I am in, actually in this house, my fiance's grandfather hung himself when this used to be a barn, and it's right in this corner right there where he hung himself. The house itself has been around for several hundred years, but before that, it was another building that was a washing house for all of the washing of the village, which was owned by a feudal lord. The women who were in charge of doing the washing, they also got to stay within the house. When the feudal lord died and the land was distributed, the washing lady, who was still in charge of the washing house, got the land and got the little shack there. She and her husband then added to that house. Then it became the house that this is now. And my fiance's mother, my soon-to-be mother-in-law, she is the great-great-great-granddaughter of the washing woman of the feudal lord. There's a few more greats in there, but and her job was doing washing as well. That was she did the washing for other people who couldn't afford it, or couldn't do it themselves. Like, so she was a washing woman most of her younger adult life, until everyone started getting washing machines, and then they didn't need her as much anymore. But when most people are talking about tradition, they are living far away from any sort of living examples of what tradition might mean. Most of the time they're living in cities, usually American cities. Those tend to be the places where people are most, righteous, most woke about how ancestry shouldn't matter. Unless, of course, it's a specific kind of ancestry, if you're the right sort of ethnic or racial classes. But they don't actually have any living connection themselves to anything back a generation or two. I didn't either until very recently. So it took me a very long time to understand what tradition and ancestry really meant. I had this idea, and I would do my little ancestor shrine, but it was not until I actually saw people who, for whom their ancestors are literally always around because they are living in the house or in the village that their ancestors lived in or helped build. Here the small Catholic Church during Toussaint, All Saints, etc. Everyone goes and stands in front of the graveyard or in front of the grave of their family, of their dead family. This graveyard goes back hundreds of years, and they're still remembering these people because the graves of their ancestors are literally here. We Americans don't have that. Many Europeans don't have this as much any longer because of capitalism. Everybody has to move to find a better job, and we've decided that's a great thing. It's a great thing to be mobile anywhere we want to go, but then we've completely lost connection to what ancestry means, what tradition means, what family means. And then so just like the idea of the noble savage or the primitive, we put this overlay over it, like what it it's this is the power of it. Like I'm gonna talk to my ancestors now. And it's like, well, have you ever tried talking to your family first? Because your ancestors are part of your family. Like, if you hate your family and then are looking at ancestors, or for the extreme right versions of this where they scream about them having the correct tradition and only certain people are allowed to this. It's like, that your ancestors fucked around a lot, like European tribes were not closed off things. Like everything was just this big mess. But being in the end of history, as it were, we try to reconstruct these ideas from fantasy without ever looking at the materially existing remnants of this tradition or these ideas that we can then just pull at the thread a little bit and then suddenly, find that we've got an entire tapestry in front of us that we haven't noticed.
So, yeah, I absolutely agree. And it's... So I still think we need a definition of tradition then, right? Because and it's one of those things that's really difficult to fix. And I'm not even sure, other than saying something like, which maybe is all right, other than saying returning to relation with, even like the past is constructed. Like I can't even really finish that sentence. Like returning to relation with, I don't know, the continuity of...
Who taught you how to speak English?
Yeah.
Who taught you how to speak English?
Parents.
Yeah, and who taught them? Like their parents, right?
Yeah.
That's tradition. As far as that is the how did you learn this language? You learned it because of tradition, because someone passed this along to you. Someone, and of course it changes. Like it's not the set thing where you have to be speaking the English or whatever language that your great-great-grandparents spoke. No, that changes. But that transmission is what tradition is, I think.
Cool. So like becoming aware of that which is passing down from a gifts and responsibility perspective. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, is that a good idea? Because the other thing, this is what I mean by it's not that there aren't the dismissal inside Rome, if we will, of like our tradition as being, very often some kind of fucked up ideas that maybe aren't that healthy. But like becoming aware of the passing down of gifts and responsibilities, because like language is a good one. So when people come into relation or back into relation with their ancestors, that process is not, I don't want to say complete, is not completing until you come into relation with the descendants as well. Like, because it's like, what are you're actually stepping into or becoming re-aware or becoming aware of a current. And so when it comes to tradition, it's not just the things you fucking get, it's also what comes with that, surely?
Yeah, like I also like the idea that, all right, okay, so Walter Benjamin, he used the phrase "the tradition of the oppressed," with, you know, and in his sense of tradition, that was also culture. You know, you know, what we call culture now, like, oh, this is a cultural thing. Like everything we do that has any sort of involvement with other humans is in essence cultural. And we're constantly passing down, but also passing across, and getting passed back well, cultural forms as you might want, but ways of living, ways of seeing the world. And we've been taught to hate anything that was older, and any older idea, you know, that's all primitive, as it were, or backwards, or regressive, or what's the word they keep calling me now? Reactionary. Sorry.
Oh yeah.
I always forget. Like, I'm a reactionary. It's great. But
how come you don't get Nazi? I get Trumpist Nazi. The gay Jew over here gets Trumpist Nazi.
So the problem is, like, everybody knows I've written for years against fascism. Like, you can look me up, and yeah, you'll find like some Twitter and Tumblr bot, whatever, that will say Rhyd Wildermuth is a fascist, you know, or whatever. But for the most part, though, then they, you know, if you look up Rhyd Wildermuth fascist, you get like 30 essays that I've written about how to fight fascism, how to undermine the fascist. You know, like, that's the problem. Like, so they can't really easily call me a Nazi or a fascist because I have this whole body of work where I've written it. So instead, it has to be reactionary, or what was it, radical traditionalist. Now
see, this is why I wanted to talk about tradition.
Right. You know, it's just like they come up with some great things. I'm also apparently a Satanist who is best friends with Jack Donovan. Like, that's still my favorite sort of thing. Like, okay, whatever, guys.
Yeah. I get to be the gay Jew who can't vote in American elections because he's not an American. Yeah. It's like Nazi crypto Trumpist. I don't know. It's fun. It's like, you know, spin the wheel.
You know, I actually, yeah, someone had like mentioned, oh, you were in trouble again, or you know, people were angry about something you had said or whatever. So I did like a little bit of looking, and then there was this funny thing where it's like, you know, like Rhyd Wildermuth has gotten his books. So, oh no. You know, and he got them for free from Scarlet Imprint. They gave him books for free. Like, it's a conspiracy. Like,
we are literally the Red-Brown Alliance doing the bidding of
right here. Yeah. You know, but, so how do we get on this? Well, yeah, how did we get on this? We were talking
I don't know. We were talking about tradition. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So here's the thing. Like, Walter Benjamin was trying to, which, by the way, everybody, Jewish Marxist, just so no one's like, oh, who is this guy? He was a Jewish Marxist, not a fascist. He was writing about the way that fascism was organizing people, and he heavily talks about it being a machine thing. You know, the point, or a recurring theme within his I think best work, which is Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Specifically, that the machines that we're using have turned us into someone who can use machine. Like, the machines teach us its own logic. This is something that Paul Kingsnorth has been on a lot as well. And there's also this other tradition, though, this tradition that's a bit older, that is before these machines, before the camera, before the record, etc., of, you know, actually performing music or creating music that isn't for reproduction, that it doesn't get put into the machine to be reproduced. You know, art before the ability to reproduce it on a mass scale meant something different to humans. And that is, in essence, part of the tradition of the oppressed. or what he's talking about. That this stands beyond or outside of these new developing ideas of what it means to be human. We had this older idea of what was being human that still persists. It continues throughout all of this. Like, you know, even though I don't even remember how many people are on Facebook in the world, but there's a lot of people not on Facebook. You know, like, yeah, you go down the street and it looks like everybody has a smartphone, but there's actually lots and lots and lots of people who don't have a smartphone. There are still people continuously being a different kind of human than we are. And I don't mean like an older primitive version. I mean, they are living a different beingness, as it were, a different humanity than what we've been changed into. And I think when we talk about tradition, you know, we locate it in the past as this thing that we kind of want to pull back, but it's really just in our past. There are other people who are still, you know, our past is still the present of other people. That is their living reality. And that shows us that we can always return to it. We don't have to, you know, completely destroy our world or try to find, like, you know, dig up ancestry stuff and DNA tests or whatever to try to get to what it used to be like for my ancestors. All you need to do is look at the people who are still currently living as your ancestors did. It's right in front.
And so I opened my book, and there's a sort of long elaboration of it throughout the whole thing, with the notion that the Enlightenment had to invent the past as we understand it now as the things that came before the Enlightenment, which were primitive and less sophisticated, because the story of the Enlightenment is quite literally the ever advancing and improving into the future linear progress and domination of science, right? So there's
they had to call the Middle Ages the Dark Ages, in order to call this the Light Ages,
and we kind of had to. So when we look for, and what I like about it, and it's in the introduction because it's so important, is that this isn't itself an old and stupid idea. Like, this is Bruno Latour's "We've Never Been Modern," right? And so this whole idea of, like, when you look at what is still with us from the past that is old and new, you kind of can't, I think, look sideways, look horizontally in a healthy way until you get through that sort of Bruno Latour idea that, like, we're not looking at people who are different to us moderns with their, like, perpetuating archaisms. Like, it's the same. Like, there's old and new ideas. It's just that one of our dumb, stupid old ideas is that we're modern, and it's this sort of trick of relation to time, right? And that's sort of coming back to your point. The life ways that are there for us to take enrichment and inspiration from. Literally, the whole point of my fucking book. They're still around. We can forget, as you say, like, not everyone's on Facebook. Very few people, I think, actually are. But an example that still inspires me is that even today, the majority of the world's food is created by small farmers. Now, we have, and rightly so, concerns about, in particular, people like Bill Gates now being the largest farmland owner in the United States, whilst also investing in, you know, pseudo meat products that require high nitrogen inputs that he won't tell us where that comes from.
Just even mentioning Bill Gates has just made you a conspiracy theorist. Like,
true. Like, that one I don't mind. Like, a
rich landowner. Like, remember when
mine's the only podcast show that got the war right. So I'm gonna keep that label. But anyway.
Landlord and feudalism was literally, you know, lord and feudalism was literally the person who owned all of the land, and then you have you know, our new lords owning all of the land. Like, nothing's changed.
I know. Well, that's another thing. Another continuity. But the point is there. You can actually look horizontally and find stuff that's still pretty fucking cool, which is that the majority of the world's food is still made, slight majority, it's only about 60%, is still made on small farms. And that means, like, small farms mean that there are people who are making food for their neighbors. Quite literally, that's sort of like the difference. That's really good. That means, like, not all is lost. You know, it doesn't mean like, hey, well, then everything's fine. It definitely doesn't mean that, but it does mean not all is lost, and that's kind of cool.
One of the other things I open in there, like, you know, where I say, like, if you want to know what being pagan is, look at the moon. Like, that's one of the first steps. But one of the other things that I've told people, like in person, is like, hey, try growing a plant. Just try, try doing this, because when you start to actually relate with something really natural, basic, something that humans have been doing for a very long time, you start to realize that these ideas of how complicated it would be to go back, to access this tradition are actually much simpler than you think.
Mm-hmm.
It literally is as simple as starting to grow plants and understanding the relationship between plants and food, soil and plants and food, soil and humans, beginning to understand that. And that's a really easy physical step. All you have to do is start with seeds. Like, I like how, like, so I read Starships forever ago, and I always meant to write a review. I never did. But you end it with something that, like, is very close to what I kind of suggest. Like, for me, just like, hey, go out into the woods and just be, and see what that being does. And you say, like, go out under the stars, light incense, and see what happens. And it's kind of the same thing. It's this very basic, go do something very simple that humans have always been able to do, that we've forgotten mattered to our human existence, and then see what happens. Like, you don't need someone to hold your hand throughout the entire path. You just need someone to point you to the door and realize, oh, like, that door actually goes to the outside, not into an inside. Like, just go outside and see what happens. Go play. Yeah.
We want it to be, and I think there's elitism's maybe not quite the right word. We want it to be more exclusive. That's what I'm after. So we want it to work better. We want it to be like, well, I need the right opinions and the right accoutrement. But incense under the desert sky, just being with the desert sky changed humanity multiple times. Is a one sentence description of Starships.
And it's such a terrifying, beautiful experience. I'm sure it was terrifying for others before we really got captured by the machine, but it's even more terrifying now. That moment when you realize, oh fuck, everything that I thought mattered, and then this, how do I make sense of this? And that, that's the beginning of wisdom, and it doesn't have to be the desert sky, but that's a great place to do it. Like, or just go stand and stare at the ocean, and throw your phone in the ocean too, please. But
there's enough fucking pollution in the ocean, Rhyd.
Yeah, okay.
No, I get what you mean. Absolutely. Don't take it with you.
Look at it properly, but please dispose of it.
Yeah. That's one of the because we sort of both live in rural context at the moment, and hopefully forever. One of the things that it was easier once I got off social media, or whatever that was 18 months ago, but I used to use, and I still do, I'm not going to lie, I'm not running for Jesus here, but I used to use the, say, morning walk as podcast catch-up time and all the rest of it. And the moment attempting to learn enough Spanish to, like, get from the airport to the fucking hotel when I get to Mexico in a couple of weeks, and that's not going great. But if you can do that, being in the more than human world without devices, it's honestly like rehabilitation after surgery. It feels so weird to start with, but it's kind of essential. But you sort of mentioned in the book, when it is about quote unquote pagan rituals such as they are, the disappointingly simple rituals rather than the complex ones that require courses and expensive books, is leave your fucking phone when you go out into the woods.
Well, it's not even the physical machine itself, it's your relationship to it. It's it's not, you can have your phone in your backpack the entire time, and that's okay. But the thing is, your phone will not stay in your backpack.
Yeah.
Because you will keep pulling it out, because you'll keep thinking, like, oh, hey, what's this plant? Let me look it up. Instead of like, oh, what's this plant? Let me contemplate this for a while and stare at it. Okay. Oh, this looks kind of familiar. Okay. Later on, I'm going to go find out, but right now I'm going to experience this plant as it is. you know, that's the thing with the machine. The machine demands you relate to the world through it. It demands to be the prime mediator of your experience in the world. Yeah. You know, whether that's the phone or the car. You know, the car is the same way. Like, well, you know, I could walk there, but I'm going to drive. You know, like, you know, it's the same way with my bike. You know, like I could walk, but I'm going to get on my bike and I'm going to bike there. You know, like then I'll walk from there. But, you know, we still, like, the minute that you can do that, it demands to be used and it demands to mediate your experiences. And, you know, it's the more complicated the machine, the more complicated our relationship to it, the less direct our relationship is to nature. You know, we keep having this extra mediation that eventually it feels like we can't escape from.
Yeah, exactly. What I've been doing with the language lessons, because the other thing that I kind of learned over the last couple of years of doing that, especially as we've been trapped here, is if you're going to be in the more than human world, be in the more than human world in that pagan beingness sense of, like, you actually need to be able to hear it as well. This is not, if you put headphones in and are listening to whatever, you've essentially turned the more than human world into a screen, because you're really only encountering it visually, and the whole kind of point is to be away from the screen.
Yeah.
But if you are going to do that, the trick, because I'm on the clock to get some really basic Spanish in, is I airline mode my phone so that if I do need an image or whatever, it's there. Like, made this mistake the hard way. Download the language lessons first and then airline mode it. But they're kind of way, and it's like people want it to be far more elaborate. It's like, well, what magic words do I say when I'm out under the desert sky? Nope. Yeah, not that. All right. One of the questions, and this is almost adjacent, but out of the many incendiary essays you've written that you could include in the book, the cultural appropriation one, why that one? And a sort of a follow-up, like, serious question, what's the point? What's the point? I mean, who are you writing these things for? But, like, why the cultural appropriation one? And that's a real question, because
because it's not about cultural appropriation.
Yeah.
So, like, I'm actually, I guess as a secret, like, you know, I include it and I say, oh, read this because a lot of people have concerns about cultural appropriation, etc. That's not, I wanted to put it in there because it's pretty much my theology. Like, that is, like, if you want to know what I think of the gods, it's right there, you know. Especially, you know, I call it a plague of gods for a reason. Like, one of the things that, this came to me a long time ago and it just always haunted me. It's like, there are gods who do not care how this ends, only that it does. You know, the pagan idea, which is the, like, witch talk, like, whatever. By the way, I just discovered what witch talk was. Like, people were talking about it. I'm like, wait, what is it? It was like, okay, so what is TikTok? Oh, it's an app. Wait, am I too old for that? Yeah, I think I'm too old for that. Okay, so I'm not going to download it.
For the next year and a half, you're still too old for it because you're not a pedophile. Yeah. It's still, the average age is still like 19, and if it's average age, it is getting older. Like, but at the moment, like, if you start using
this idea that if you're not interfacing with this, if you're not, like, in it, then, like, you don't know what's happening. It's like, you know, I remember thinking that my life was the most relevant thing in the world. Like, my context was when I was 19, and I was wrong. You know, you all are probably wrong too, and it's okay. You'll figure that out later. No problem. But you know, I call that essay a plague of gods specifically because we have this idea of the gods and the spirits or whatever being these really sweet, nice things that are here to help humanity. You know, it's the pink plastic fairy that was at the base of those ancient standing stones, which were probably a human sacrifice site. You know, this idea, like, oh, we can come to these really ancient, like, massive powers or these really big things, the same way that, you know, I remember one time I was with, it was my partner at the time, and we were in Britannia. We were on the coast in Karnak, or right next to Karnak. All of these old megaliths. There's one standing in the middle of a field, and it looked cool. So we both like ran up to it. And it was like right at sunset. And I was like, oh, cool, let's go see it. We're running, and we both suddenly had this moment of absolute, complete fucking terror. Looked at each other, dropped our bags, and ran. And it was like, wait, yeah, that was silly of us, wasn't it? You know, this idea that like that the it's the equivalent of trying to pet a wolf, you know, like, oh, cool, it's nature. Let me, you know, no, it's not like that. You know, there are some really brutal aspects of it. Like war is a part of nature. You know, the world is brutal. Like it's not all nice. And what I'm trying to get across in that essay, with this idea of like, oh, well, no, you shouldn't be worshiping gods like this because, you know, they belong to these people, or no, we should not be doing this because we're, you know, stealing from someone else, or that doesn't belong to you. It's like, no, you're missing the point. Like there's none of this belongs to anybody. And it is all ultimately as terrifying as that desert sky with no moon, you know, like that is fucking terrifying. And that rips you apart. And that's what ultimately, that's really the core of what my experience, or what I'm calling being pagan, is. Like it's a moment of like terror, but then also what, you know, the Catholics might have called reverence. You know, not in this like, oh, you know, oh, this is great, but like, oh, holy fuck, you know. So yeah, that's the real reason why I included it.
Yeah, good. Dr. Jeff Kripal, who's been on the show a couple of times, says in one of his books, and kind of reminds you, like, remember in the Old Testament, encounters with God can kill you. Lot's wife, for instance, is a really good example. And so we like it. This is where, just coming back to the beginning of the show, where I had no interest in paganism, because it is very often a label used to make having official opinions personally interesting, but that's certainly not like being pagan, right? But that's why I'm like, well, which of all the incendiary essays, I was wondering why the cultural appropriation one was in there. But I like that. I like it removes what can very often be a psychological, maybe isn't the right word, crutch for people to avoid authentic encounters with the more than human. How's that?
Well, okay, so yes, and I'd also bring up one other point that is like really subtle that probably no one ever noticed, and that's okay. But it's an argument with David Graeber as well. So I rely heavily on their work, David and Marshall Salen's work on kings in that. You know, they come to this conclusion in On Kings, and I haven't read Dawn of Everything, but so far I've heard from people who agree with my take on Kings that it's the same sort of thing where, you know, here's all of this proof that humans have been kind of this default anarchist sort of, you know, way of being, and kings and society and civilization and all of this is always a kind of, or hierarchy is always a temporary matter that we kind of put in place for a little bit, but then we get rid of. You know, and they both mention repeatedly the way that most of the tribal animist African rituals with gods were to chase the gods away. You know, and they see this as like, you know, kind of this. They miss the point of that, which is that, like, you know, yeah, sometimes we have to, we need to keep the gods away, but then we can only keep them away by interfacing with them this way, or letting them in these other ways. And when we don't let them in these other ways, then, you know, it becomes a plague. Like they spill out, they become everything. That's, you know, the whole idea, like, you know, oh, it's cultural appropriation for an LA hipster to have a tattoo of Kali on her back or what have you. And it's like, oh no, that's her escaping.
Yeah.
You know, like, look what we've done. Like, and that's going to keep happening, and that's going to keep happening. And this idea, like, no, we need to put them all back in their place. This should only be for Indian people. Like, it's like you're using the same logic, the right sacred, to try to contain them. And it's like, unfortunately, the left sacred, which is that brutal, bloody, menstrual, like semen, all of these like really nasty, dirty things that we try to shove down and put away, that are the actual core of being human, will completely research and keep doing that, and it'll wreck society, and that's kind of cool.
It is that on that level, absolutely. There's and I agree completely. There's the kind of idea and for people to kind of put this, that it is very much an imperial project to keep cultures separate on European maps. Like the first Indian men, obviously, like young men who were invited to university in England during the days of the Raj, weren't allowed to wear suits like the rest of the students who were matriculating. They had to wear the fucking turbans and the silks and all this kind of stuff. It's like these exotic Indian princelings, and they just wanted to wear fucking suits and smoke pipes like the other students who were there. But like, no, you're Indian, this is how you dress. And this kind of idea that you can kind of have a plate of food where nothing touches, like a toddler, is a right project of control. Like and so the it's one of the kind of like, which I know you've written about and maybe we can get to, but there are these like genuinely totalitarian and literally from the right beliefs that there are people who play anarchists on the internet are mainlining and promulgating, and it's the most fascinating upside down world.
Oh yeah. So are we talking about them now?
Yeah.
Well, okay. So you mentioned in an email that that you thought it was amusing that you had kind of dropped the vestiges of Marxism in your kind of process, and I had dropped the vestiges of anarchism. Like, and I think what did that for me was this realization that I, and also, all of the anarchists I knew had a really, pink plastic fairy idea of power, of violence, of brutality, of all of these things that have existed within humanity, as far as we know, as far as humanity has existed. And how those things can be controlled or kept at bay or whatever. Like, there are ideas on it that if we just, build more tolerant, communicative, mutual aid societies, like we can, we can have a better world, as it were. Like this fantasy, this utopian idea, a better world, we can always do this. And then noticing that at the exact same time that people are saying this, they are acting incredibly brutal to each other. Specifically because they couldn't possibly believe that they're being violent. Understanding your own capacity for violence is one of the hardest things ever, but it's really the core of being an adult, I think. It's at that point, like when you finally realize, I cause a lot of harm, and I can actually potentially cause much more. And I make people hurt. Ouch. Okay. But people make me hurt. Okay. That happens too. But once you get to that realization, then you realize what you can do about it, how to mitigate those things, how to avoid moments where those are going to happen. And then also make decisions on when, sometimes it's necessary to lay down pain. It's a very rare thing, but sometimes you have to do that. But if you suppress that, if you sublimate it into this utopian idea of a society without a sort of violence, or we can get rid of hierarchy, because hierarchy is the problem, and then suddenly you end up acting like a hyper totalitarian, pro hierarchical person, and watching that around me, like I just realized, ooh, okay. I was doing this too. So I can't really blame them. Like, this is not a, oh, these idiots are stupid. But then I realized, oh, okay, this doesn't work. I need to look at more things, you know, that shift away from that fantasy, I think, is what has caused some people to think, oh, whoa, he's going right wing now. It's like, no.
Yeah.
If you need to label me as that, okay, that's fine. But, you know, within your same realm of stuff like self-identification matters, and I don't identify that way. Sorry.
Yeah,
I've always wanted to just, like, you know, oh, you say I'm a fascist. Well, I identify as a leftist, so
yeah,
this is declarative identity right here.
Yeah, well, but it's caught in that infinite loop, and that's kind of.
I think that's, you know, we are all capable of doing this. We all do this to some degree. Like, we, you know, this is also like the core of Nietzschean, like, resentment, where, you know, we fixate on the pain that other people cause to us, or our sense of being a victim in some sort of incident, real or imagined. It can be totally real or it can be totally fake, but the sense is still there. And then we narrate the world in a way where we are not ever potentially also people who would make victims. You know, like, we are the victim. Therefore, we see everything from this. We ally ourselves with other victims, but hopefully not as much victims as us, because we need to have more victimhood than them, because then we lose our identity if we don't, you know. And that's going everywhere. But it's not just anarchists, you know. Like, you look at right-wing people who are like self-identified right people, you know, whatever, they feel like they're victims too, you know, like they totally feel like everybody is out to harm them. That's like, or maybe you have some sort of agency that you have been abandoning this entire time. And maybe if you stop putting an ideological overlay over, you know, all of your experiences, and instead try to, you know, go out to the fucking forest or go under a desert sky, go experience things again, and then see how that feels later. Like, see if those things you told yourself about yourself, and those things you told yourself about others, and about how the world should really work, make any sense at all when night is falling and you're in the middle of an ancient forest and you're going to have to walk through in the dark.
No, I agree completely. It's funny you mentioned the agency thing, right? Because that's kind of where I ended up. And the dawn of everything on Kings, I know Graeber identified as an anarchist, and that's fine. And Dawn of Everything's a bit more anarchist, but where I kind of dropped, not entirely, but where I sort of stopped defending Marxism was, like, he can call his view of how history works scientific. It's stupid. It's not that, like, from like a telos perspective, and this is where it comes back to the anarchism thing, right? What it both of them have an on the ground, in theory, and on the ground operating cosmovision, and also a intellectual wing, if you will, and both of them, right? And so what interests me about anarchism is, like, the West is in fact ending. So there is no kind of need for, oh, we have to overthrow it. I'm like, no, you don't. You just need to stand back. What the fuck are you watching? So there's this kind of, like, anarchism had, to me, not that I identify with any of these, and in fact, Corey, who I mentioned last time, obviously from immediatism, when she says, like, I'm pretty much a post-anarchist now, like, definitionally. What is that? No. But I was listening to her the other day, but we mentioned her last time you were on the show. I love her, but she said she's pretty much a down the line post-anarchist now, and I think that's basically where, if I had to be pigeonholed, I'd end up as well. But it's because it has an opportunity. Charles Eisenstein says it's not about what can you do, it's where can you do something. And I think that's germane as we head into kind of like the end of the West, but also these masses of people who self-identify as Marxists and anarchists are, and I'm going to use your words, hang on, let me bring up the screen share. Just like when you had a look around at what people were saying to do with, like, the trucker protests in Canada, and having all these, once again, so-called anarchists being in vocal support of literally the kind of tyranny that would get Stalin hard, like stuff.
I've had, oh my Yeah, I don't even. I feel bad even talking about this, but one of the experiences that I've had with a lot of my former comrades, as it were, who some of whom I still consider friends. I think some of them are terrified of ever being associated with me again because, there was a call to kick me out of Portland, Oregon. Like, hey, everybody, make sure Rhyd can't go in there because he's obviously a fascist, and it's like. I don't even live in America anymore,
Yeah.
And honestly, I don't ever want to go back to Portland. It was crazy. But one of the things that I heard very often with, the COVID stuff and the mask mandates, et cetera, was an explanation of how, what the governments were doing was correct. And the only accurate critique about what the governments were doing is that it didn't need to be the governments doing it. It should have been the people. So, instead of the government mandating that everybody gets, this amount of vaccines, which, it was like that here. It was very cumbersome. I had the first one. I've never gotten boosted. My fiance is right now in the other room with COVID. He just got it after getting 4 total shots, all of these regimes like that the governments were putting together, they were cumbersome, but it was kind of okay. And what we had here was so much more restrictive than what was going on in America, but at the same time, there was this sense that, God, this is really awful. We shouldn't be doing this. And as soon as this is over, we know we need to stop doing this because the people will rise up and overthrow us, which is what's happening in Germany right now. The whole fear of a far right / anti-vaccine movement is specifically because the government has said, yes, we're going to lift the restrictions, but we're still going to force everybody to have a vaccine no matter what. It's like, wait, why? So all of the restrictions go away, but now you still have. That's not a lift, But listening to the arguments, what I would hear is that basically we don't need the governments to do exactly what the governments are doing right now. We ourselves could, tell people you're not allowed in these spaces unless you go get the shot. Like you're not, don't show your face up here without a mask. If you do, I'm going to punch you in the face or whatever, like I will hound you, the community will hound you, the people will hound you out of the village, or into the town square, whatever, because you're not doing the right thing. You're harming the community. This is the state logic.
Yep.
But this became the anarchist logic. And what was really fucking bizarre to me, and I still cannot get over this, how like the anarchists and the communists kind of switched on this.
Yep.
Where and I think though it comes down to, communists have like this really kind of brutal idea of what power is. Lenin, Stalin, we've seen this, they have this sense of like, to have this kind of revolution, there will probably have to be a lot of violence, and that's really awful, and we don't know what to do about it. Whereas the anarchists kind of have this idea like we could just, do a little bit and then everybody's going to wake up. Or we can just educate everybody in the schools and then suddenly we'll have the society that we want. And we might have to beat up a couple of fascists, but otherwise we'll have our thing. Whereas the communist idea is like, oh, no. The amount of power that we're up against would require a massive organized violent movement. So them already having this understanding and then seeing how COVID mandates were being put in place, and they were never the same in every country. That the strangest thing with the Canada thing. So Canada wasn't allowing previous infection with COVID to count as vaccination. Europe, which had much harsher restrictions, was. If you had COVID, you could show that you had the doctor's note, hey, yeah, I just had COVID like 4 weeks ago, and this is the date I was cured, and they're like, okay, cool, you can come into this place, take your mask off, that's fine, and this is more restrictive than what Canada was doing. Canada would not allow that, and that was a big core issue in the early days of the trucker convoy, where it's like, wait, no, I just had COVID. Why are you now making me get a vaccine? All of the scientists are saying, hey, you won't get COVID again, at least for a long time, because you have the antibodies. And it was not placed the same way in every country in the world. It was different. Everything was different everywhere. And I think Marxists were able to look at this and say, well, yes, this is how states work this, and the idea of like, if we were to then have a Marxist state later, how would we implement this? Well, the way that the capitalist state is doing this is really awful. Maybe this is not how it should be done. Maybe there are other ways that we could have pursued public health policies that did not take away individual rights. Whereas the anarchists, because they don't already have this admission that, violence is kind of at the core, not just of state relations, but of most non-amicable social relations, just thought that, oh, well, what the state is doing is how it should be done, and then we could do this too. And that's what led to so many of them, I think, being hyper, jingoistic about masks and jingoistic about vaccines. Not just supportive or hey, this is an unfortunate thing, but hey, you better fucking get your vaccine right now or else. That's
is there yes, but is there not a even simpler take, which is that anarchist has more cachet as a social media label at the moment?
Oh, especially America. No.
But actually, so you look. We look to see, well, what's a genuine anarchist critique, and you look out there and go, well, it's clearly not that, because that's just like this middle of the road, breathless perpetuation of neoliberalism and the destruction of the global working class. And so, because you'll have to point me in the direction of the Marxists who got this right. I think there are people who are Marx-ish, like Agamben, that got it right, but you'll have to point me at that.
It's also a little bit probably broader than I think most people, count as Marxists. But Agamben is I think one of the primary examples. But also you could look at a lot of the labor unions here in Europe. In the United States, the labor unions rolled over immediately. Here in Europe, they said, well, wait, you're telling these workers that you've already negotiated these contracts with that they cannot go to work any longer. You're going to take away their livelihood unless they do this. No, you can't do that. This is a labor issue. And this was a Marxist labor issue. Whereas in the United States, no, there was nothing like that. But, there's no labor unions there anyway, or there are, but, barely. And then when people try to suggest that maybe there was a labor issue in Canada, it was like, oh, you fascist.
Exactly.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
You can even make it identitarian. Like in 2020, in the states that measured it, like New York, 1 in 3 small Black-owned businesses ended. Nothing has been that destructive to Black wealth ever. And so you can even make the identitarian case, but no, again, you get the very idea. And it's just, here we are at the moment where the only reason some parts of the world are pretending to drop these measures, and it is pretend, and this is my point that I'm coming back to, is because it's unpopular in the polls. So England is was one of the first European countries to allegedly or seemingly drop its state restrictions. However, going through Parliament at the moment are changes to the definition of human rights law, which will enshrine the idea that you don't have any if your right might be at risk or might be risking the majority, which is just redescribing forced injections, but also that they're retaining some of their emergency laws and putting them everywhere's doing that. It's like, well, we'll roll them back. And I'm like, you've rolled them back. And everyone says, we'll roll them back. And if we get sick again, we'll bring them in. And I'm like, no. You roll them back and you take them out the back and set fire to these emergency rules. But we haven't. Like, the goalposts have been permanently moved.
Like this, every anarchist should know this, but they don't.
Yes.
Like, give the moment a government takes power, like you can't claw it back from them. They're not going to give it up willingly. And this has been a very, very, very long process for a very long time, where governments keep claiming more and more power over individual and group human life. And if there's no pushback on this, like, what is the phrase, like, rights aren't something that are given, they're something that are taken.
Yep.
And, that's always how it's been. Like, the civil rights movement was not saying, like, hey, can you give us equality? It was like, hey, we will shut down things unless we get this. That was a taking. And right now, like, everybody's just rolling over so quickly, but I get it. They're kind of terrified. There's been so long where like, especially if they've been on social media, like, it's just every day, every hour, every thumb scroll is hey, here's another reason to be afraid. Here's another reason to be afraid. I have no agency. I have no power. Okay, let's argue about how to, about how other people are at fault for this crisis.
Exactly. Like, if you talking about there not being a center of the road, and I agree. Like, we're in broad agreement that a centrist position is bloodthirsty and in no way moderate. Even by those standards, you think if you told people 2 years ago that you would be calling for the death of your fellow citizens in like amongst the working class, or the refusal of medical treatment, you're like, wait a minute, like. The injection rate for Black New Yorkers is still only 50%. But you were calling for the death of Black New Yorkers of the working class.
If
that
they
fucking escalated quickly.
It, because they didn't get the vaccine, then they deserve to die. And it's like, whoa, that's a great position.
Yeah. And because one of the more recent, everyone should be reading Rhyd Substack, of course, but as we move into the next couple of years that culminates in World War III beginning 2024 to 2027, you hear that first on my podcast, and I've been right about when the war started. Going to unfortunately be right about this. Doesn't matter. As we have all these, the state has seized so many more.
I'm sorry.
What was that?
When does it start?
2024. Like, it's shit in Europe between now and then, but like the proper war starts no later than 2027, and the chance of it being more than 50% is from 2024. And this is the same model that got it right to the month. All this stuff that people said Putin's not going to invade. I'm like, well, we've been planning for it. But that, if you can, people are welcome to listen to the astrology forecast that I do with Austin, and you'll see me there saying that in December. Anyway, we're now moving to the next narrative, the war narrative. Because the COVID one doesn't allow for the further perpetuation of these rights seizures and reorganization of this kind of like technocratic, supranational organization of the world. And you're kind of writing about it here, where once again, you would expect the takes to not, they don't necessarily have to be good, but not in the absolute toilet of of like a hyper. So from 2 years simping for big pharma, now we're simping for the military industrial complex and neoliberal expansion. And what do riddle me this? I don't know. I just wanted to say that.
Okay, so something much larger has been happening to the way we think. And, there's this, you can actually look it up. NATO actually has it on their website. This is not like this crazy, like, conspiracy sort of thing. The link is there, where they were talking about cognitive warfare, being like an extra step beyond propaganda, like not convincing necessarily people to think certain things, but convincing people to think in certain ways, to treat situations in a certain reactive way each time, which would then mean that they would be less likely to resist, other things. And they were talking about, the enemy, by which they meant Russia, doing this to them. But then in the same thing, they say, well, and then we need to get better at this in order to do the same thing. So, but what they're really talking about is the same thing that, every priest of every monotheist religion has known, that like it is not just enough to get people to, to confess their faith. You need to teach them a framework by which they will continuously see the world in a way that maintains that world that you've created. maintains that order, so that they don't question it. And then they'll automatically start to identify aberration to that, and either be disgusted about it or push it away, or just feel like whatever that person said must be from the devil or from the enemy, or whatever. And that started before COVID. COVID, I think, was probably the first time we've really seen this on a very wide scale. But this sort of training people into a new cognitive framework has happened for a very long time. And now, so quickly, from everyone blaming a small group of people who have not gotten vaccinated for the reason why everyone is dying and you can't go to brunch, to everybody screaming about there being Russian spies everywhere on social media, and watch out. And I broke my rule of staying off of social media a few days ago. I went on to Twitter, which is a fucking nightmare. And we said earlier, having the right opinion on Twitter, there are no right opinions on Twitter. But what was really curious to me was seeing all of the examples of both sides, as it were, Russia and NATO or whoever, using the exact same images and re-narrating them according to, one was a group of 6 soldiers that were all laying down. And there was a Ukrainian news site that said that these were captured Russian soldiers. And then there was another website, which was another Western one, but not a Russian one, that said that they were captured Ukrainian soldiers. Or one of the most viral posts that went around for a little while was a picture of a young blonde girl screaming at a soldier, telling him to get out, and the caption under it was Ukrainian girl telling Russian to leave. It's like no one has any memory, because this was the video we all saw years ago from Israel. It's actually a Palestinian girl yelling at an Israeli soldier. She is obviously speaking Arabic. He is obviously speaking Arabic back to her. But, what the fuck is happening? Watching this, everybody just, it's like this, everyone's rushing to create this myth and rushing to believe in something really hard. And the harder you believe in it, the more there's an enemy somewhere, all of these lists of people you're not allowed to read, or you shouldn't be reading, or, there are Democrats in the United States, Democratic politicians suggesting, hey, actually, maybe we should get rid of Russian immigrants. And it's like, weren't you upset when Trump was doing that to Muslim? What did you do? What happened? How did you get to this? And it's the machine. This is what the machine teaches you to think. They're thinking like machines. They're thinking through the machine. And they're reacting, and good gods, are we all in trouble?
Yeah. The faked images, this is, you called me, and I as I said, I proudly take it, and I'll tell you fucking for why. Let me tell you who wasn't hoodwinked by the fucking rain shower of faked imagery that we had in the first week of the Russian incursion, and that's conspiracy theorists, because the images coming out of Wuhan in those first couple of weeks, where there's just a guy lying flat down on the ground, with a mask on, oh, he just died of these dozens of fake images coming out of Wuhan. What you just said about war, same thing with Assad in Syria. All those images of him gassing people were from Israeli actions in Gaza, and just run through the BBC and the rest of it. Us conspiracy types all knew that, and here we are. And conspiracy theorist, by another word, is someone who's and you write about this a bunch of times, and it's where I'm going with this. Surely it is a left position, certainly an anarchist one, to be immediately suspicious of state narratives, particularly when they're intertwined with either big pharma, most corrupt industry on earth, or the military-industrial complex, most deadly.
I would restate that just a little bit differently. It doesn't matter what sector. What I mean, state actions when they're in line with the capitalists.
Yeah,
right there.
And what ones aren't?
When there is a large capital that is in sync with what the state wants, then any I mean, the very definition of leftism was being like, hey, actually, I feel like they're colluding against us. That's why we're all for, but it was like, it's the first thing that was abandoned, where you don't question that. And anybody who does say, or if anyone uses any of the, and I avoid like the plague, like usage of any of like a word that they'll find is like a trigger sort of thing. It's easier to just say, the capitalist. Of course, then that, yeah, but some capitalists are good. Or, of course, I'm against capitalism, but, and there's always some extra.
As I support Justin Trudeau's actions on my slave-made smartphone for likes on a hyper-toxic platform.
Do you remember when the Israeli government paraded a bunch of soldiers throughout the United States that were all gay and trans?
Yeah.
This was, I remember this too, because I was still in the United States at the time. And it was nice, actually, because there were a lot of gay rights groups that were like, what are you all doing here? This is really weird. Like, they're all coming to gay pride parades. And of course, it was right at the same time that they were starting to do extra incursions into the Palestinian territories. And it was like, wait, so you're using our gay identity in order to make us more okay with a foreign state powers thing, where like their policies. Justin Trudeau did the same thing. Like he was dancing at gay pride parades. Like he's cool, like kind of sexy. And then like Lukashenko, same thing. Like he's cool and sexy, whatever. And it's like, why, like they pulled, but I mean, they were doing this during the Iraq invasion.
Yeah.
Like this was the maddening thing where like, like if you did not support the like killing Afghans and killing Iraqis, then you were not a feminist. You are not a true like gay rights ally, because this was going to liberate women and this was going to liberate gay people. And yes, it was actually going to liberate, women from their bodies. Like they were going to die, but this was liberation. This was, that was the beginning or what I called like the proto woke ideological formation, where that was the beginning of tying specific social justice identities to imperialist policy abroad to try to gain support for these things. And I think like it's just increasing where,
it's still doing it now. There are some takes coming out of, I think it's British Foreign Office, where supplying arms to Ukraine is for LGBTQ rights in Russia. And and this is kind of, because I want to bring it back to the book, because there's two challenges here, and it's why I think the book lands where I want it to land, and it's sort of where I sort of situate myself on a post-anarchist level. There is no redeeming the people, I don't think, and I don't mean like to dismiss them. I mean literally only they can transform the mental capture in which they find themselves. I don't mean like the same way they do like you can all die and not have medical treatment. I mean like there's actually nothing. My father's a retired now, but psychiatrist, and we were in Micronesia one time, and this guy picked us up in the bus, and he thought it was Friday, but it was Saturday, and I was arguing with him, and Dad's just sitting in the back. The reason this is important is because he dropped his kid at school thinking it was Friday, and it was Saturday. And so I managed about 20 minutes into this bizarre argument driving around this island in this ancient van that it was Saturday, and he had to race back to the school to pick up his like 6-year-old kid who's just like standing at the front of the school crying. But we get to the end, we get back to the hotel, and I say to my dad, like, why did you not say anything as I'm having this 20-minute argument with this guy, whether it's Friday or Saturday? And he's like, he's a psychiatrist. He says, you never argue with the mentally ill. And so he's just sitting in the back, breezily letting this chaos happen. And I think that when it comes to the people who have been ideologically captured, and maybe it's just me noticing it, but I think it's worse, or the capture is more total than it was with, say, Iraq and even Syria. I think it's more total at the moment. But you can't break someone out of that. They have to do that self-transformation themselves. And funnily enough, one of the things you can do, this is a weird way of getting back to the book, right, is it's not even on the level of competing frameworks or cosmovisions of description. It's actually in the doing and the being of something outside that reality. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's like... you can't convince people to go back to their body, the body that they are, but that's the only path that will get them back to where they need to be. But you can do little interruptions, like the culture jamming in the late 90s, early 2000s, like that. That was always a brilliant idea where suddenly there was an advertisement that was selling something that didn't make any sense to show you, oh wow, you've been, like the advertising you've been looking at is propaganda that is playing with your desire. This one makes no sense. Oh wait, what happened? You can introduce or attempt little short circuits, and sometimes that short circuit is as simple as like, hey, have you eaten today? Or hey, how is your body feeling right now? Are you in pain? I mean, something I noticed and very often is like the angriest people. If you look at their social media accounts, you'll also see them talking about chronic pain very often. Or about how shitty their personal life is. And then suddenly they go on a crusade with somebody. They're really like, oh, I'm so angry. And it's like, of course you're angry, you're in pain, And sometimes it's like do you need a hug? Or like, hey, can I give you a glass of water? Or hey, take a breath. Like sit up, take a breath. Okay, how do you feel? Are you still angry now? Do you still think that right now, like, there are Russian spies everywhere on Twitter? Like, and maybe go for a walk, and then go into a forest and be there a little bit too late and try to shout all of these ideas that you have at the trees in the darkness and see if they make any sense. Like it is possible to interrupt it, but you cannot actually, you lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. Like you can't force them, but you can sometimes kind of trick people into, so you talk about the mentally ill. My mother is schizophrenic, and I was a social worker with mentally ill people for a very long time. Like you can't fix their condition, but oftentimes you can get them out of a point where they're decompensating by drawing their attention to something else, or, and literally it was often as simple as like, hey, are you hungry? Can I make you some food? And that was usually enough to get back to the body to deal with whatever, stimuli that was occurring, like, okay, now I've eaten. Oh, it turns out there were not, demons and police and lizards in my closet. I was just anxious because I was hungry, and that doesn't permanently fix it for people who have been in that state for a very long time. But, for people who are new to this state, or people who, aren't suffering from other things as well, like, there are ways of getting people back to their body by reminding them they are bodies.
Yeah.
But you
the key there, like one of the words there you said you can't force them into it is like the key word there is force. Like if you are, and it's true. Like if you're perpetuating force by forcing, like you could force feed them, but then we're stuck at the situation of like, how do we solve an excess of force by forcing people to do things? Isn't actually where the medicinal intervention, I think, can be found. Nice one. All right, so I'm just going to jump back to the screen share. I was going to razz you for this, and which is Australian slang, and say I was going to jump to your website under the book section, rhydwildermuth.com, to point out your book, but it isn't there yet. And I was about to say, I don't think it's there. But the reason I'm not going to,
I don't think I ever put it on there. Oh, look at that. Yeah,
well,
thanks.
I'll tell you why I'm not going to razz you about it is because my latest book isn't in my book section either. So this is rhydwildermuth.com, where you can obviously find a whole bunch of Rhyd's stuff. This is the book in question where we began our discussion, Being Pagan. And where else can people find you, and where do you want them to buy the book and other stuff you got going on, etc.?
The best place to find me is, well, actually, you can come to Luxembourg and visit me. Like, that's
true.
Like, we've got space here. But Rhyd.substack.com. It's from the force of Arduino is the name of the Substack.
There we go.
I do all of my writing there right now. Some of it's still at A Beautiful Resistance, but for the most part, it's there. It's a subscription based where, you subscribe for free or paid, either way. You get to read most things for free. You get to read extra things if it's paid. But that's all sent to your email, which is cool because I got shadow banned on Facebook a while ago. So, you know, except for when I post shirtless photos of myself, nobody sees anything. Oh, and you know, I posted like my wedding announcement there, and like hundreds of people saw it. But then I wrote something else, like, or posted something else a few days later, and no one saw it. So
yeah, it's. I'm actually happy with not Substack specifically, but the evolution in response to how all these kind of conversations and restrictions have been going. And Substack, I'm sure, will fall eventually underneath the thumb of the rest of the genuinely insane levels of like propaganda and restriction we're experiencing now. Like officially RT isn't allowed on Facebook in Europe and all the rest of it now. And you think, so Substack, I'm actually enjoying this kind of like, it reminds me of 18th century pamphleteering, this sort of return to newsletters. And so Substack is the best, I think, fulfillment of that at the moment. It won't be, I think, by the end of this year, just because that's how these things go. But that behavior change is really exciting, I think.
There's been so many articles from major news sites like claiming it's like a haven for fascists, for transphobes, for COVID deniers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, I'm sure very soon, like, in the next week, you'll start seeing like, it's a haven for Russian propaganda. Like whatever is the big thing that is going to make people lots of angry against it will be a news article. So eventually, you know, if that site starts fearing government regulation, they will start, you know, clamping down on some things. But, you know, for now, it's been great. You know, who knows next? Well, I guess war is next, huh? But,
yeah. I think like behaviorally it's a nice change, because what I've noticed, and I've helped in this, particularly for premium members and so on, my background being digital media, is even before the sort of pandemic narrative of the last couple of years, where everything was getting so awful and controlled in the public internet, is like, how do we move from monolithic pseudo connection like a Facebook or Twitter feed to something a bit more like a meshwork, or like rhizome is overused, but that like rhizomal connection of smaller, more intimate groups in relation to each other. And one of the things I find really, and this is again very Gnostic, interesting, is that people will ask, okay, so what platform do I use? And I'm like, no, you're missing, that's not what I mean. Like at the moment, it's things like Substack and Telegram, but it won't be eventually. What you want is authentic connections in sort of like smaller shared groups that are aligned in partial alignment and interest with others, rather than this monolithic feed where you have to hear your aunt's opinion about AOC. Like that's not, this is a terrible place to find nourishment, I think. And so I'm really excited at this sort of like Substack world, I think, at the moment.
No, it's been working really well. It's I've actually written more since I joined that than I ever did when I was doing my own blog and writing regularly at Gods and Radicals. And I think it's specifically because both of those formats I relied on social media, you know, to tell people, hey, I just wrote something. You know, now, you know, I post those in social media as like kind of a perfunctory, like, okay, here, if you're still not reading me, you know, otherwise, but if you look at all of the stats, like 99% of them are people who have specifically signed up to read my stuff, and that list keeps growing. And it's like, oh, well, this is what we thought Facebook could have been years ago, where I friend somebody because I want to know about them, and then I don't know anything about them except for what Facebook lets me see in my feed. You know,
and people who are on your list, and by the way, if you are on the list, you should do this, but people who are on your list will forward the emails to people, hey, you may like this. Thus, it is a personal and authentic person-to-person connection, so you don't get the same dopamine hit of hundreds of likes, but which you might get like 5 new subscribers from putting something out, but they're real people who read a thing that a friend gave them and go, you know what, actually, I want to, whether it's agreement or not, it's like, I'm just going to keep reading this for a while. And that's the powerful like behavior change that's different. We share things instead of one to many on like a one-to-one or one-to-few level, and that connection is slower growth but more authentic.
Yeah, well, and also, you know, we're limited in how many people we can interact with anyway. Like it's always been that. You know, I've like almost 5,000 friends and 2,000 followers or something on Facebook, but I don't know any of them. You know, like, I mean, I know like maybe 200 of them in person, you know, at like maximum. And the rest of them are like, you know, and I cannot interact with them. And I also, you know, it used to be a thing where suddenly you're interacting with somebody who's extremely angry with you and demanding all of your time. And it's like, why am I doing this? This isn't exactly. And this is actually pulling away time from being creative. So no, I'm not going to do this.
No, exactly. There's that famous RuPaul saying, "Other people's opinions of me is none of my business," and I think that's a good thing for people to learn. But all right, so we've got where people can find you, and yeah, really great chat. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you, and congratulations on yours. And I will read it, and when I finally read it, which it's going to be a while because I'm still working on a book that's coming out from a UK publisher at the end of the year on woke ideology. But when I finish the manuscript and send it off, then I'll actually have time to read other books, and then I will read yours and I will review it.
Love it. All right. Well, thanks once again. Always a good chat.
Finally review Starships too.
Do a double. Yeah. Because I keep threatening the Scarlets that this is my Empire Strikes Back. Like, I have a dot trilogy, and so this is 1 and 2, and that'll probably happen. But that will be fun. All right, sir.
Of the clones, please.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Good chat, and thanks everyone for participating in the chat as well.
Have a great day.